He didn't have a badge, didn't wear his medals, just sat alone at the edge of the airfield in a faded windbreaker, ignored, overlooked, until the F-22 Raptor broke formation, dropped altitude, and saluted him. No announcer explained it. No one. Had to. Welcome to Legacy Valor. Before we continue, tell me in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today, and if you believe some legends walk in silence, hit the subscribe button to support the channel. This is one of those stories. The crowds were already 3 deep by the time the gates opened at Langley Air Base. Families with coolers and folding chairs hustled to find spots with decent shade under the few scattered trees along the fence line. Kids waved those little plastic F-22 toys you buy at the gift shop for $20, making whooshing sounds as they dove the miniature jets through the air. Veterans, some in dress blues that still fit after all these years, others in unit caps and polo shirts with squadron patches, gathered near the roped-off section closest to the runway. You could hear the stories starting already, voices carrying over the growing crowd. Remember when we flew out of Hickam? That was back in '89, before they changed the whole program. Volunteers in bright yellow vests directed traffic, handed out programs, and answered the same questions they'd been answering all morning. Restrooms are past the merchandise tent. No, you can't bring your own chairs into the VIP section. The demo starts at 1400 sharp. The loudspeakers crackled to life with that familiar scratchy welcome that sounds the same at every military air show from coast to coast. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the annual Heritage Flight Showcase. Please keep all personal items clear of the flight line, and remember that photography is permitted in designated areas only. But nobody noticed the man who'd arrived just after sunrise. He didn't come through the main gate with everyone else. He walked quietly along the fence line, past the merchandise stalls where they sell overpriced hot dogs and Air Force t-shirts, past the photo booth with the cardboard F-35, and kept going toward the eastern edge of the tarmac. Far from the stage, far from the fanfare, far from anyone who might ask questions. He was old, 80s, maybe older, thin frame in grey slacks that looked like they'd been pressed that morning. A worn Air Force windbreaker zipped up to his neck despite the heat. No name tag on the chest, no unit patches, just a faded insignia at the shoulder that you'd have to know what to look for to even notice. He moved slowly, but there was nothing uncertain about it, and in his left hand he carried one of those simple folding lawn chairs. Nothing else. When he approached the volunteer desk at the edge of the veteran seating area, this teenage girl, with a name tag reading Sarah Volunteer, looked down at her clipboard, scanned the rows of names, then back at him with the kind of apologetic smile they teach you for these jobs. "I'm sorry, sir. These seats are reserved for those who pre-registered. Do you have your confirmation email or registration number?" The old man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. He opened it carefully, revealing what looked like an old military ID behind a plastic window, but he closed it again before showing her. Instead, he just shook his head slightly. "No registration," he said quietly. "I'm really sorry," Sarah said, and she meant it. You could hear it in her voice. "If you'd like, I can check if we have any general admission spots available. Or you could try calling the registration line when they open on Monday." "It's all right," the old man said, already stepping back. He didn't argue, didn't ask to speak to a supervisor, didn't pull out his phone to show her anything. He just nodded once, with a politeness that somehow made Sarah feel worse about the whole situation, and walked away. He made his way maybe 30 yards east, past the last row of official seating, past where the rope barriers ended, and found a spot right against the chain-link fence. No shade, no flag, no program, just hot asphalt, open sky, and a view that was probably better than half the VIP section anyway. He sat down, placed his hands in his lap, and settled in to wait. People walked past without really seeing him. A few glanced over, the way you do when someone's sitting by themselves, but nobody lingered. He wasn't part of any unit reunion, didn't wave to the honor guard setting up their formation, didn't have that expectant look of someone waiting to be recognized. But the way he watched the sky felt different. It wasn't casual, like a spectator enjoying the show. It was focused, intent, like he was reading something up there that the rest of us couldn't see. A little boy, maybe 9 years old, broke away from his father's grip and wandered over to the fence. Kids do that, you know. They see someone sitting alone, and their curiosity gets the better of them. This one had chocolate ice cream smeared on his Air Force t-shirt and was carrying one of those foam gliders they give out at recruitment booths. "Were you a pilot?" the boy asked, loud enough that a few heads turned in their direction. The old man's face softened into something that wasn't quite a smile. "No," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I was what came after the pilots failed." Boy scrunched up his face, trying to work that out. He set down his foam glider and leaned against the fence. "Like rescue? Like the Coast Guard?" "Something like that." The old man looked back at the sky, then down at the boy. "What's your name, son?" "Tommy. My dad's in the Air Force. He works on computers, not planes." Tommy pointed back toward the crowd. "He says the F-22s are the coolest jets ever made. Do you think so?" The old man considered this seriously, like it was an important question that deserved a real answer. "I think," he said finally, "that the coolest thing about any aircraft is that it brings people home safe." Before Tommy could ask anything else, his father appeared, walking over with that apologetic parent look that said he'd been searching the crowd for his wandering child. "Tommy, there you are. Sorry about that," he said to the old man, extending his hand. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. And you are?" The old man shook the offered hand but didn't give his name. "Just enjoying the show." Tommy hesitated for a second, then did something that made everyone nearby go quiet. He straightened up, as tall as his 9-year-old frame would allow, and saluted. Not perfect. His thumb was sticking out, and his hand was a little too high. But sincere. The old man didn't return the gesture. He just reached over and gently adjusted Tommy's hand position, moving his thumb in line with his fingers, lowering his arm just slightly. Then he nodded once, with a kind of gravity that seemed too heavy for the moment. "Keep practicing," he said. Tommy beamed like he'd just received a medal, and Rodriguez felt something in his chest tighten as he watched his son walk back toward the crowd, standing a little straighter than before. Near the command tent, Captain Avery Nolan was running through his final checklist, trying to keep 17 different moving parts synchronized. As Deputy Operations Coordinator, he had radio checks with the tower, timing confirmations with the demo teams, weather updates, security clearances, and about 6 different contingency plans depending on wind direction. The Raptors were scheduled for the closing pass, and every second had to be precise. One missed radio call, one aircraft off by 30 seconds, and the whole sequence could turn into an expensive disaster. He was reviewing the flight pattern one more time when he grabbed his binoculars to scan the perimeter lines. Routine security check, making sure nobody was where they shouldn't be. The eastern fence line was supposed to be clear, except for essential personnel, but there was someone there. A lone figure sitting where no one should be sitting. No badge, no escort, no explanation. Nolan's first instinct was to call security. Protocol said civilian areas needed to be monitored, especially during active flight operations, but something about the man's posture stopped him from reaching for his radio. That stillness, that way of watching the sky. It wasn't casual curiosity. It was something else. He adjusted the focus on his binoculars and studied the man more carefully. Grey slacks, polished but old shoes, and that jacket. Air Force blue, but not current issue. The fabric had that particular fade that came from years of wear, not from sitting in a closet. Then he saw the patch on the shoulder, Strategic Air Command. Nolan felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd only seen one of those patches in person, hanging in his grandfather's closet back in Ohio next to a Purple Heart, and some photos his grandfather never talked about. SAC had been disbanded in 1992, before Nolan was even born, but this wasn't some vintage find from a surplus store. This one was positioned correctly, worn in the right places, faded in a way that only came from actual service. He lowered the binoculars and grabbed his tablet, fingers moving quickly across the screen. The veteran database was something he'd never actually used during an air show, but he wasn't operating on curiosity anymore. He was operating on a growing certainty that he was looking at someone who shouldn't be sitting alone by a fence. The search parameters were narrow, strategic. Air Command veterans in the database, filtered by era and location. Then he saw the second insignia, smaller, tucked almost invisibly under the windbreaker's seam, but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. Combat controller. The quiet operators, the ones who went in first and came out last, if they came out at all. The ones who talked aircraft down in the dark, with nothing but a radio and nerves of steel. Nolan's fingers moved faster across the tablet screen. SAC combat controllers, Vietnam era, declassified records only. The list was shorter than he expected, a lot shorter, and when he cross-referenced it with the geographic data, Master Sergeant Eli Barden, combat controller, Strategic Air Command, 1964 to 1985. The file was mostly black lines and redacted sections, but what remained painted a picture that made Nolan's hands shake slightly as he read. Laos, Cambodia. Operations that still carried. Classification levels he didn't have clearance for. 2 separate instances of being declared missing in action. Both times he'd walked out of places where walking out wasn't supposed to be possible. There was a recommendation for the Medal of Honor from 1971, declined by the recipient, a citation that used phrases like extraordinary heroism under fire and voluntary exposure to overwhelming enemy forces before trailing off into classification codes. The final entry was dated March 15th, 1982. Retirement processed at service. Member's request. Declined ceremony. No forwarding address provided. Nolan stared at the screen for a long moment, then looked back toward the fence line. The man hadn't moved, still sitting in that same position, watching the sky like he was reading something written there in a language only he understood. Eli Barden wasn't just a veteran. He was a ghost story, the kind of legend that got whispered about in advanced combat controller training when the instructors thought no one was paying attention. No photographs in the squadron heritage rooms, no interviews in Air Force Times. Just stories that got passed down from class to class, getting a little more mythical with each telling. The guy who called in strikes on his own position. The guy who stayed behind to guide rescue birds through SAM sites. The guy who never came to reunions because officially half the missions he'd flown had never happened. And if that was really him sitting out there by the fence, then the volunteer with the clipboard had just turned away someone who deserved a seat at the head table, not a folding chair in the dirt. Nolan stepped out of the tent and keyed his radio to the Raptor team frequency. Raptor 1, this is Nolan. You copy? Captain Brooke Harlan's voice came back clean and professional from the cockpit. Go ahead, sir. Nolan hesitated. There was no protocol for this. No manual that covered what to do when a living legend shows up unannounced and gets turned away from the VIP section. There's a spectator at the eastern fence line, he said finally. You'll see him when you make your pass. A pause. Instruction, sir? Nolan looked back toward the fence, where an old man sat alone in a lawn chair, watching the sky with the patience of someone who'd spent a lifetime waiting for aircraft to return. You'll know what to do, he said. At exactly 14:10 hours, the F-22 Raptors launched. The sound hit the crowd like a physical thing. It started as a low rumble that you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears, then built to a roar that made conversation impossible. Kids pressed their hands to their ears and squealed with delight. Veterans shielded their eyes from the sun and smiled, remembering their own days on flight lines. Cameras came up by the hundreds, people trying to capture something that no photograph could really hold. The jets climbed in perfect diamond formation, 4 grey arrows punching holes in the afternoon sky. At 3,000 feet, they split apart, in a textbook starburst that had the announcer reaching for his most enthusiastic voice. Ladies and gentlemen, the United States Air Force Raptor demonstration team flying the most advanced air superiority fighter in the world. For the next 12 minutes, they put on a show that justified every tax dollar and then some. Barrel rolls that traced perfect circles in the blue. Knife-edge passes where the aircraft flew sideways, showing their full profile to the crowd. Vertical climbs that seemed to defy not just gravity, but common sense. The jets climbing straight up until they were just specks, then rolling over and diving back down with enough speed to make the air itself scream. The formations were so tight, you could have covered all 4 aircraft with a blanket. They flew in diamond, then line abreast, then echelon, each transition smooth as silk. Captain Brooke Harlan in Raptor 1 called out the marks over the radio, her voice steady and professional even as she pulled enough G's to make a normal person. Pass out, diamond break in 3, 2, mark. Rejoin high left on my call. Solo pass, Raptor 3 cleared hot. The crowd ate it up. Every pass brought cheers, every formation change brought gasps, kids waved flags. Adults took pictures they'd probably never look at again, but couldn't help taking anyway. But then, as the jets lined up for their signature final formation pass, the one that would bring all 4 aircraft across the crowd at 500 feet. In perfect diamond formation, something changed. But then, as they lined up for the final pass, something changed. Raptor 1, Harlan's jet, began to drift. Just slightly. Not enough to trigger any alarms, but enough for anyone watching closely to realize she wasn't following the scripted pattern. The other 3 Raptors held formation, completing their final maneuver exactly as planned. But Harlan kept drifting, banking gently, then aligning herself on a heading that wasn't in any flight plan. She was going east. Nolan saw it first from the command tent. He stepped forward, pressing his headset tight against his ear, watching the F-22 descend to an altitude. That made no sense for the finale. "She's breaking formation," he said to no one in particular. The crowd started to notice too. Phones pivoted, conversations stopped. The announcer, suddenly uncertain, tried to cover. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain behind the barriers. What you're witnessing is a slight course adjustment." But it wasn't. Harlan leveled her wings, cut her speed, and made a single deliberate pass over the far perimeter fence, right over the old man in the folding chair. The jet moved like it was flying through church air. No afterburners, no dramatic angles, just a clean, respectful line, with the nose dipped just enough to be unmistakable. At the fence, Eli Barden didn't flinch, didn't wave, didn't stand up or raise his arms or do any of the things you'd expect someone to do when $30 million worth of fighter jets salutes them personally. He just placed his right hand over his heart and held it. There, that was enough. The Raptor pulled up gently, rejoined formation, and disappeared into the afternoon haze. The rest of the demo concluded perfectly, every maneuver hitting its mark, exactly as planned. But nobody was watching the sky anymore. The entire crowd had turned to face the eastern fence line. It started with just a few people, those closest to the fence, who had the best view of what had just happened. But word spread the way it does in crowds, whispered conversations and pointed fingers, until everyone was looking in the same direction. Someone near the bleachers, a man in his 60s wearing a Vietnam veteran cap, slowly removed his Hatton held it over his heart. Then another veteran did the same. A woman in Air Force dress blues stood at attention. Then an entire row of ROTC cadets followed suit, rising as one without anyone giving them an order. The applause started somewhere, in the middle of the crowd, not the enthusiastic cheering that had followed the aerial demonstrations, but something quieter, more deliberate. The kind of applause you hear at memorial services and retirement ceremonies when the clapping isn't about entertainment, but about respect. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been standing with his son Tommy near the concession stands, felt tears he couldn't explain stinging his eyes. He didn't know who the old man was, didn't know what had just happened or why it mattered. But he knew it did matter. Somehow. In some way he couldn't put into words. It mattered more than anything else he'd seen that day. "Dad, why is everyone clapping?" Tommy asked, tugging on his father's sleeve. Rodriguez looked down at his son, then back toward the fence where the old man was slowly folding his chair with the same care someone might use to fold a flag. "Because sometimes," he said. "No," Nolan said firmly. "There won't be, because officially nothing happened here that wasn't supposed to happen. Understood?" The lieutenant nodded slowly, though he clearly didn't understand at all. But Nolan understood. Some things couldn't be explained in after-action reports. Some gestures couldn't be reduced to incident numbers and violation codes. What had just happened wasn't a breach of protocol. It was protocol working exactly the way it was supposed to work when the art overruled the handbook. By the fence, Eli Barden lowered his hand and reached down for his chair. He stood carefully, folded it with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times, and turned to walk away. Nobody tried to stop him. Nobody asked for his autograph or wanted a selfie. The crowd just watched in respectful silence as he made his way back along the fence line, moving with the same unhurried dignity he'd shown all day. He wasn't there for thanks. He hadn't come for recognition. He just wanted to see if anyone still remembered what it looked like when the sky brought people home, and that one pass had answered everything. The bus driver at the base gate looked confused when the old man climbed aboard. Civilians usually didn't catch the end-of-day shuttle. But he opened the door anyway, and Eli took a seat near the back, setting his folded chair in the aisle beside him. As the bus pulled away from the airfield, someone in the crowd began to clap. Not loud, not showy, just one person acknowledging. Something that couldn't quite be put into words. Then another joined in, then another. By the time the bus disappeared around the corner, the entire field was applauding. Not for the air show, not for the spectacle. For a man in a faded windbreaker who'd carried his stories in silence for 40 years and had finally been seen. Back in the operations tent, Nolan was filing his report when Captain Harlan walked in, still in her flight suit, helmet tucked under. Her arm. "Good flying today," Nolan said. She nodded, then reached into her chest pocket and pulled out something small. An old mission patch, worn and faded. "My father flew with someone like that once," she said, setting it on Nolan's desk. "Never got to thank him properly." Nolan picked up the patch and studied it. Strategic Air Command, combat controller. The same insignias he'd seen that afternoon, but these ones still had their colors. "What do you want me to do with this?" he asked. Harlan was already walking toward the door. "You'll figure it out," she said. The following year, nobody officially invited Eli Barden to the Heritage Flight Showcase. No email went out, no phone call was made. But when the maintenance crew arrived at sunrise to set up the barriers and check the perimeter fence, they found something that stopped them in their tracks. A folding chair placed against the eastern fence line, exactly where they remembered seeing an old man sitting the year before. The chair was clean but weathered, with a handwritten sign, taped to the back in careful block letters, "Reserved for those who never asked." On the seat was an old windbreaker, faded Air Force blue, with patches that told stories most people would never hear. The Strategic Air Command insignia was there, just as faded as it had been on the old man's jacket. But pinned to the collar was something new, the mission patch that Captain Harlan had left with Nolan, its colors still bright against the worn fabric. Sergeant Mike Torres, the crew chief responsible for perimeter setup, called over his supervisor. "Hey, Chief, what do you want me to do about this?" Chief Master Sergeant Patricia Williams walked over and studied the chair for a long moment. She'd been setting up air shows for 15 years, had seen every kind of memorial and tribute you could imagine, but something about this simple setup, this quiet statement, made her chest tighten. "We work around it," she said finally. "Work around it? Set up the barriers like it's supposed to be there, because it is." The word spread through the setup crew, then to the security personnel doing their morning sweep, then to the honor guard practicing their formations. By the time the gates opened, everyone working the show knew about the chair in the eastern section. Nobody questioned it. Nobody moved it. It had become part of the landscape, like the flagpoles and the announcement booth and the static aircraft displays. During that year's demonstration, something interesting happened. The F-22 team had a new pilot in the number 2 position, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, fresh out of weapons school, flying her first major air show. She'd heard the story of the previous year's Phantom salute from the other pilots, though officially, no one discussed deviations from approved flight plans. When the time came for the final formation pass, Chen found herself watching the eastern fence line. The chair was there, empty but somehow significant, that old windbreaker draped across the back like a silent sentinel. Without thinking, without planning, without any official authorization, Chen dipped her wings as she passed over the fence. Just slightly, just enough for anyone watching to know it was intentional. When they landed, the flight lead asked her about it. "Not sure, sir," Chen said, pulling off her helmet and running a hand through sweat-soaked hair. "Just felt like the right thing to do." The flight lead nodded. He'd been flying air shows for 8 years, had pulled the same instinctive maneuver the year before when he'd seen an old man sitting alone by the fence. "Next year," he said, "we'll make sure the whole team knows. Some traditions don't need to be written down to be important." And that's how it started, not with official orders or formal protocols, but with that gut feeling every pilot understands, the knowledge that some gestures matter more than regulations. Within 3 years, every F-22 demonstration team pilot knew about the chair in the eastern section. The younger cadets started calling it the Phantom Salute, though the older officers preferred the recognition pass. Whatever they called it, it became as much a part of the routine as the takeoff. Checklist new pilots learned about it during their briefings. "When you make your final pass," the flight leads would say, "you'll see a chair by the eastern fence, wings level, slight dip, then continue on course. No radio calls, no dramatic maneuvers, just acknowledgement." What's it for? The new pilots would ask. For the ones who never asked was always the answer. And somehow, that was explanation enough. The base commander, a different one now, the previous one having rotated to the Pentagon, tried to get more information about the tradition during his first heritage flight. He asked his operations officer, who asked the maintenance chief, who asked the security supervisor. None of them could give him a straight answer about when it started or why. Finally, Chief Williams, now approaching retirement herself, was called into his office. "Chief, I need to understand this chair situation. Is it authorized? Is it safe? What's the protocol here?" Williams thought for a moment, then said, "Sir, some things don't need authorization. They just need respect. That chair represents something. We can't put in a regulation or a technical order. It represents the people who served in silence and never asked for anything in return. The pilot who makes that recognition pass isn't violating any order. He's fulfilling the most important one we have, which is, take care of your own, even the ones nobody remembers to take care of." The base commander, a career pilot himself, who'd lost friends in places whose names couldn't be mentioned in official reports, nodded slowly. The chair stayed. 7 years later, when Chief Williams finally retired, the farewell ceremony included a presentation of the windbreaker from the Eastern Fence Chair. It had become tradition. When a senior enlisted member left the base, they were given the responsibility of finding the next person to maintain the memorial. Williams passed it to Senior Master Sergeant James Park, a veteran of 3 deployments, who understood the weight of carrying other people's stories. "It's not about glory," she told him during the private ceremony. "It's about making sure nobody gets forgotten." Park nodded and accepted the faded windbreaker with the same solemnity he'd once reserved for folded flags. The chair is still there. Every Memorial Day, every Veterans Day, every Heritage Flight demonstration. Sometimes people ask the volunteers about it, and the volunteers give them the short version. It's for a veteran who was honored by the pilots. They don't usually mention that nobody knows his real name, or that he only came to one air show, or that he never asked for any recognition at all. They just say it's reserved for someone special. And that seems to be enough, and every time the jets make their final pass, one aircraft, sometimes the whole formation, adjusts course slightly, dips its wings, and acknowledges the empty chair where a ghost once sat. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever met someone like Eli Barden? Someone who carried more than most people could imagine, but never asked for recognition? Someone whose silence spoke louder than other people's speeches? If you have, write their name in the comments below. Let this space become more than just a video. Let it be a place where we remember the ones who never asked to be remembered. And if you believe these stories deserve to be heard, hit the subscribe button to support the channel, because some legends walk in silence, and it's up to the rest of us to make sure they're never forgotten.